So what happens when you eat is that insulin goes up. So most foods, almost all foods, have a mixture of macronutrients, fats, carbohydrates, and protein. So your insulin goes up to a varying degree. And insulin basically is the hormone that tells your body to store fat. So it stops your body from burning fat. You start to store some of the sugar and store some of the fat. Okay? And this is normal. This is a normal situation. So carbohydrates get turned into glycogen, which are chains of glucose. So chains of glucose in the liver is basically a storage form of sugar. Okay? And when you have too much of that, then your liver produces lipids, which is called de novo lipogenesis, and it basically stores fat. Okay? So when you don't eat, when you're fasting, so fasting is merely the absence of eating, your insulin levels fall. And that's a signal to start pulling some of that energy out, right? So you're going to start by pulling some energy out from the glycogen, which is your stored sugar, and you're going to pull some energy out of the stored fat. So you can think of it, the glycogen, like a refrigerator, right? You're storing food energy. And the reason it's like a refrigerator is that it's easy to access. So you can put food in easily. You can take food out easily, right? It's just food energy. And the fat is more like your freezer, okay? So you can store more of it, but it's in your basement. You know, it's hard to get to. It's hard to get out. It's hard to put in. So you generally prefer to use your refrigerator. And it's the same idea. You have two storage forms of energy. One easy to use and one not so easy to use. The refrigerator, though, has a limited capacity. So if you have too much stuff, you have no choice but to put it in your freezer. Now, the reason that the calories don't work is that they operate on what I call a one-compartment model. Okay? So that means they pretend that all your calories goes in to your body, and it's all the same. All your calories are the same. They're stored in one giant compartment, like this sink. And when it comes to taking out energy, it all comes out of the same thing, right? Therefore, if you follow this sort of very simplistic, incorrect model, what you see is that if you simply reduce the calories going in, you'll reduce your weight. And if you increase the calories out, you'll increase the rate. But the entire premise of this sort of calories in, calories out model is completely fictitious, because we know that's not what happens in the body. The body doesn't have some giant vat of calories, right? You can store sugar, you can store fat. It's not some giant vat of calories that's held somewhere in your liver, right? But that's what they all pretend it is. So if you have the entire wrong idea of why this should work, then it's not going to work. What instead is a better model is a two-compartment model. That is, there are two places in the body where you can store food. You've got your fridge and you've got your freezer. Your calories goes into your fridge, and your calories goes out from the fridge, because that's the easiest place it goes. But there's a third thing that you have to consider, and that is how much food goes back and forth between the freezer and the fridge, because that's what we're really interested in. This, the fat, that's the one that's much harder to get to, right? And the question is, what's controlling this? Because that's really the key. And it turns out that the main player is insulin. We know this because insulin inhibits lipolysis, right? What that means is it stops you from getting the fat coming out. That's its job. That's its normal job. So if you have a lot of insulin, right? So normally if you eat a huge meal, your insulin is high, it's going to tell the body to move all the storage in this way. If your insulin is very high, then you can't get the food back out this way. And that's the problem. So if you have a lot of insulin resistance, for example, which keeps your insulin levels very high, it's like that freezer is kind of locked away in the basement behind a locked, steel bar. You can't get at it. So what happens now when you start reducing your calories? If you start reducing your calories in and you can't get at your storage, what your body is simply going to do is reduce the calories out. That's what it does, right? Because it's not going to keep losing weight until you die. That's just ridiculous, right? So if you look at the Women's Health Initiative, which was a huge 50,000 person study, they reduced calories by 350 odd per day for like 7 years. And they estimated that people would lose 30 pounds. Women would lose 30 pounds per year, right? So in 7 years, they should have lost 210 pounds, right? Of course, that didn't happen. How much did they lose? Not even a single pound. It was ridiculous. Because what happened, of course, is that their body, if you're not affecting the insulin, you can't get at that fat. You're just going to reduce your calories out. And notice here, of course, that we're not breaking any laws of thermodynamics, right? Calories in, calories out. Yeah, you're accounting for all the calories. But what's important is the compartmentalization of energy, right? That's what we're talking about. Not the total energy, but where it goes, right? Because that's what we want to know. If you eat and you just burn it off, who cares? That'd be great. But if you eat and all of it goes into fat, well, now you care a lot, right? But it's not that calories are imbalanced. If you eat an extra 500 calories, your body burns it all off as fat, burns it all off as heat, yeah, who cares? You don't have any extra body fat. But if you get 500 extra calories, boom, the insulin's telling it all to shunt into here, well, that's a problem. And here's the thing that I always say as people are goes, oh, how about women? Women shouldn't fast. Like, why not? Don't you think you'll lose weight? Yes, you will. Now, if you're underweight, then yeah, you shouldn't be fasting, right? You're going to get amenorrhea, you're going to get menstrual problems. But if you need to lose weight, yes, you will lose weight. And that's exactly what they found in all these studies. So you have men, they lose weight. Women, they lose weight, right? And what you can see that it's fairly steady. There's no kind of drop-off, right? There's no drop-off, that kind of dreaded weight plateau, because that's the whole problem with weight regain is that we all plateau. And there's so many advantages to fasting that are just not available in that it's completely different from most other diets which tell you what to do, because this is really the opposite. It's something you don't do, right? So one of the biggest advantages is really that it's completely simple. You can explain it in like 2 seconds. And everybody understands intrinsically what it is, right? Now there are variations, right? There's fat fast, there's juice fast, there's water-only fast, there's no water fast. There's all kinds of variations. But at its very core, it's easy to understand. And that's important because if people don't understand what you're trying to do, they can't do it, right? It's free. Like, as much as I would love to always eat home-cooked meals and, long-simmered bone broth, the truth is that most of us sometimes don't have the time and don't have the inclination, don't have the money. If you want to eat grass-fed beef every day, it's going to cost you. If you want to eat organic all the time, it's going to cost you. I'm not saying that you shouldn't, but it's expensive. And some people just have no money. So I have people who write me from the Philippines and they're like, I got all this stuff and I can't afford anything. It's like, well, there is no cost. There's no cost at all. It's convenient, right? So again, you can cook all you want, but it takes time, right? It takes time. And sometimes you just don't have the time. But this one, there's no shopping, there's no preparation, there's no cooking, there's no cleanup, there's no eating. Right? There's nothing. It's so convenient. Because again, the key is it's not something to do. It's something to not do, right? And that makes it completely different and something that you can add, something that's completely flexible, right? So it's not like, oh yeah, you need to eat 6 times a day, right? It's like sometimes you just don't want to eat 6 times a day. Sometimes you're busy. Right? Well, this is going to give you more time. You can put it in anywhere. You can do it tomorrow, and you can not do it the whole next week, and then do it again, right? You can do whatever you want. It's completely flexible. You can do it for 12 hours. You could do it for 12 days, right? It doesn't matter. So the reason that I talk about fasting and low carbohydrate diets is that what it does very effectively, and probably more effectively than any other intervention, is it empties out that fridge, right? And remember, what you want to do is get rid of all that insulin too, right? Because now, if you don't have insulin telling your body to shunt all that energy into fat, now you can start to move your calories out this way, right? If you have a lot of insulin, so we do this, for example, if we give people exogenous insulin, they can't lose weight, right? Even if they fast, it's very hard because they can't access that fat. They just keep reducing their calorie expenditure. But the whole point is that fasting provides the easiest way. You get rid of all that glycogen, you get your insulin down so you can actually access your body fat, and there. And the whole thing is that why can't you fast, right? You know, I asked my son one time, a few years ago, you know, how do you lose weight? He goes, he was 6 or 7 at the time, and he goes, just don't eat. So easy, right? It's like, oh, how can you be so right about this point that has escaped like 99% of the world's doctors and dietitians, right? If you don't eat, you're going to lose weight. And here's the thing to understand. There's nothing wrong with it. That's the way we're built, right? That's the way lions are built. That's the way tigers are built. That's the way bears are built. That's the way we're built. We're built to withstand these repeated episodes where there's no food, right? Because back in the caveman days, there's no McDonald's, there's no refrigerator, there's nothing. There are times you're going to have nothing. That's why you have fat, right? That's the whole point. You can do something called alternate daily fasting, which is kind of one day of fasting, one off. And in these studies, it's not actually a full fast, so they still allow about 500 calories on those fasting days. So it's not even a true fast, but the calories are low enough that you still get the benefits. If you look at the resting metabolic rate, which is the first line, you can see that from baseline to day 22, so you know, a couple of weeks of alternate daily fasting, your resting metabolic rate really hasn't dropped. Your fat oxidation goes way up, right? So you're burning fat. You can't argue with that, right? You can measure these things. You're burning fat. Why? Because you have no carbohydrate to burn, right? Because you're clearing out that fridge, you're clearing out all that stored sugar and burning fat. That's great. That's exactly what we want to do. So one of the most ironic things is that this is what you hear all the time. Fasting is going to put you into starvation mode, right? This is actually very ironic because starvation mode refers to the idea that your metabolism slows to such an extent that you're going to regain weight, okay? So I've heard that before somewhere, right? That's exactly what happens when you try to reduce your calories, right? If you don't do anything about your insulin and just reduce your calories, your metabolism goes down. You're going into starvation mode. But what happens during fasting? Does it happen? Well, here's a study of 4 consecutive days of fasting, right? So this is in normal people, right? And what you see is that at the top, the weight goes down, right? So that's great. That's exactly what we expect to see. But what happens to your REE? This is this middle line here. That's the resting energy expenditure, right? That's your basal metabolism. It doesn't go down. It goes up, right? You're burning more energy than you did. Now you might think, why is that so? Well, it makes a lot of sense because suppose, again, you're a caveman and there's nothing to eat. It's winter, there's nothing to eat, right? So if your body starts shutting down, then you're even less likely to find something to eat because you're tired. You can't go out there and hunt a woolly mammoth. You're tired, right? You need to sleep. So you're all gonna die like that, right? So your body is just not that stupid, right? Your body says, wow, you have nothing to eat. So I'm gonna give you energy. I'm gonna increase the amount of energy you're burning. And I'm gonna provide it from your fat stores because you need to go out and eat and fill up this refrigerator again, right? So that's exactly what you do. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, right? It'd be like cockroaches and insects running the world. So what happens to your VO2, right? That's how much oxygen you can metabolize, right? Does it slow down? No. It goes up, right? Again, you have more capacity to do exercise, more energy. And why is that so? One, you're burning fat for energy, and your body's like, ooh, there's a lot of this, right? So there's plenty of it. Let's go. But the other thing you see is that the norepinephrine, so norepinephrine and epinephrine are called adrenaline or noradrenaline. So your body is actually providing you with a big kick in the pants to keep your energy expenditure high, because that's what you need to do to survive. So insulin drops, which is one of the major things that we want to see. And your hormones, that's a hormonal, remember, obesity is a hormonal disease. It goes up. It's providing you the tools to burn fat. So there's no starvation mode. Actually, it's quite the opposite. It goes up. So if you look at what happens during fasting, what happens, because everybody worries about this, right? Oh, what about protein? You're burning your muscle, right? So this is a study by Kevin Hall from the NIH, and he basically looked what happens during fasting. And this is what happens, right? So for the first couple of days of fasting, what you see is that carbohydrate oxidation goes up. It goes way up, right? In other words, you're burning sugar. You can see that fat doesn't actually move for a couple of days. You're not burning a hell of a lot of fat, right? And then as you run out of the glycogen, remember that the glycogen is your easily accessed energy, but limited in terms of how much you can store. Once it all burns out, then look, fat oxidation goes up. Now you're burning fat for energy. That's perfect. That's exactly what we want to do. But what happened to protein? Are you burning muscle? Hell no. It goes up slightly, okay, at the very beginning, then drops. So protein is not a storage form of energy. Why would your body burn it for energy, right? You hear this argument all the time. You're going to burn muscle, right? So it's ridiculous, right? Because you're telling me that the way we're designed is to store energy as fat, but when the chips are down, we'll burn muscle, right? Okay, like I don't think so, right? It's like if you have a wood-burning stove, you store firewood, right? Because you're going to burn it. But when the chips are down, you don't go chop up your sofa and throw it into the fire, right? It's crazy. The other thing that's ridiculous is that if you have repeated fast famine cycles, like cavemen might have had, for instance, so you store fat, burn muscle, right? So at the end of a few of these cycles, you're like one giant ball of 100% fat, right? It's like that's what happens to the bears, right? It's like, come on, don't be ridiculous. You don't burn muscle. Protein, yes, you do need a certain amount of protein to maintain your lean protein, right? But it's not increased. That's my point. It's not that it's zero. There is some, right? But it's not increased in response to fasting. The other thing we talked a little bit about already is that you're going to burn muscle, right? And again, the idea is that you're going to burn protein to provide glucose, right? And this doesn't actually happen. And this has been known, again, for 20, 25 years. So if you look at urea is this big line here. So it's a breakdown product of protein. So you can see that you excrete a certain amount of nitrogen every day. You're also taking in a certain amount of nitrogen every day, right? This is under normal conditions. Now you fast people, like you just give them nothing to eat. Well, what happens? Well, there's virtually no urea coming out, right? Now there's nothing going in too, but what you notice is that you're not burning muscle, because if you're burning muscle, that urea should skyrocket or at least be as high as this. So your body is actively conserving your protein, your muscle mass, right? And that's what happens during fasting. And you can do 70 days of alternate daily fasting, right? So 70 days is more than 2 and a bit months. And what you see is that if you measure fat mass and fat-free mass in this study, you can see that fat mass goes down very nicely from 43.5 to 38.1 kilos. And the fat-free mass, your lean mass, doesn't move at all. So These are sort of some of the myths that everybody tells you, right? Starvation mode, burning protein. And here's my favorite, right? It doesn't work. That's never going to work, right? It's like, okay, genius. If you don't eat, do you think you will lose weight, right? Well, yes, you will, right? So it's not exactly a very good comeback for people to say it won't work, because it will definitely work, okay? It will definitely work. I'm not saying it's easy, okay? That's a whole other thing. Can you do it? That's a separate question. I actually think that most people can do it. It really has unlimited power, right? And as a doctor, sometimes you get into these things where you want to do something and it's not strong enough, right? Well, you can just keep fasting until you get the results you see. As I said, if you don't eat, you will lose weight, right? It's almost impossible to not, right? Can you keep it up? That's a separate question, right? I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying that, you do have to have the proper medical supervision, especially if you're on medication and so on. But you could fast. You could fast. I have a 75-year-old who did like 30 days, right? He felt great, right? The world record is 382 days. You can keep going. Right? And this is the whole point, is that this gives you options because it's not a diet. It's no diet. It's nothing, right? It's like Costanza. It's a show about nothing, right? There's a talk about nothing, right? George Costanza, so smart. That's the whole point, is that because it's the opposite, it gives you so much flexibility. And it has the ability to really free ourselves of the chains that bind us down, right? We have all these problems, right? The number one problem in the world today, right? You got heart attacks, you got cancer, you got strokes, you got diabetes, you got kidney disease, and it's all due to obesity. It's all due to diabetes. But yet, we have the ability to free ourselves from all of these modern afflictions, right? Only with the application of a technique they knew 5,000 years ago. The ancient Greeks were all about fasting, not for health. They didn't have a lot of obesity back then, but because it gave you energy, it gave you like mental focus, right? That's why they did it. And these involuntary periods of fasting eventually got taken out, right, as we started getting more reliable food. Then religion started introducing periods of fasting, right? So if you look at any major religion in the world, they have periods of fasting. They have periods of feasting too, but it's balanced by periods of fasting, right? And remember that they're not trying to kill all their practitioners, right? They're not like, oh, you should fast, you'll die, ha. That's not it at all, right? They did it because there is something deeply intrinsically beneficial to the fasting, right? And it was always known, always. It's a cleanse, it's a detox, right? There's probably only one thing that the three most influential people in the history of the world agreed on, right? So the Prophet Muhammad, Jesus Christ, and Buddha. They all agreed on one thing, and that is fasting is very beneficial. It's uniquely beneficial, not only for the spirit, but also for your body. We need to clean ourselves out of this junk that accumulates, right? All this extra sugar, all the insulin, all the fat. We need to clean it out once in a while, right? It's a spring cleaning. That's all it is. And yet, with the application of this kind of ancient time-tested technique, we can break free of all this, right? You know, in the last century, we broke free of a lot of infectious diseases, right? Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and all this. And now all that replaced with was all these diseases. But we have the knowledge. We only have to apply it. And that's the most ironic part of all. We won't. But there's no reason why we won't. We've always been told by everybody that we have to do this. And yet why do we not?
I would generally, this group, I think that we have so much in common that I don't want to pick nitpicking discussions, but Dr. Fung, I want to compliment you on a very engaging presentation, but I will disagree with you on a number of your interpretations of the published literature, particularly around nitrogen conservation in periods of fasting lasting longer than 24 hours. There's quite a bit of the literature that I'd suggest that we both should read and discuss, including Aromalis' classic paper from JCI from 1978 from the University of Toronto on how much nitrogen it takes to counter negative nitrogen balance, that is protein loss, during severe caloric restriction. And I want to take particular issue with your quote of the Cahill data and your interpretation that there was negligible nitrogen loss. The data you picked was from 28 days of total fasting. The total nitrogen excretion was 4 grams, which represents a quarter pound of lean body mass loss. And up until that time, the subjects had lost 20 pounds, half of which came from lean body mass. So there is, I don't think you can safely say that nitrogen losses are negligible during fasting.
Yeah, I think that there actually is quite a debate about this, truthfully. And, I take your point that there is a lot of people on both sides of the fence that, yes, is there protein loss? No, is there not protein loss? And it's very hard to tease out exactly what it is that is being lost here, because clearly there is a baseline protein turnover, right? I'm not saying that there isn't. We do need some protein. You cannot fast forever, right? There's essential amino acids and so on. But all I'm saying is that the body doesn't ramp up protein, which is the whole point that a lot of people try to make, right? So does the body start burning protein for gluconeogenesis, for instance? Now, there is protein loss, right? Because you start with amino acid as your substrate for gluconeogenesis, right? Even glycerol doesn't actually fulfill the entire amount. But that's presuming that all of this excess protein is bad, right? All this excess protein loss, because you've got all these things, people talk about autophagy and so on. And a lot of people talking about, well, maybe a lot of these go into that pathway of amino acids they're getting rid of these amino acids, they're getting rid of these damaged proteins. And there's people who talk about that. I take your point that there probably is, you could probably find equal amounts on both sides. 28 days, of course, is far in excess of what I generally use. I mean, there's alternate daily fasting. There's all types of different fasting.
I'd like to, at some point, dive into the data, and maybe the organizers next time we can have a debate.
Sure.
Hi, I had a question about the fasting as well. I've having watched some of your literature online, you've spoken a little bit about how the fasting has created a benefit, and I might not be saying this correctly, but a benefit to insulin resistance. And I can see that, of course, during the fast. But I was interested if you could speak to, what are the results as far as going, what are you seeing after that? Are you seeing patients, who are continuing on a low carbohydrate diet, having significantly better blood glucose numbers and better markers of less insulin resistance, I guess? Or what are you seeing later on? Because it's unclear to me. I can imagine the benefit of the weight loss during a fast, but I'm unclear as to what the long-term benefit is later on.
Yeah, it's something that you really have to follow people on, right? It's not like you can do a 2-day fast and that'll take care of the last 30 years of sugar and bread, right? It's something that you have to catch up on, and it's a time-dependent process, right? The insulin resistance is a time-dependent process. So, I mean, I've probably supervised close to 1,000 people on various fasting regimens. We work with them individually on what they like to tolerate and what they don't like to tolerate. But most of them do have to continue for some time, because you got to realize that by the time you get to see me, it's usually about 20, 25 years of this kind of excessive insulin state. And it's not going to go away in a month, right? Even if you do a lot of fasting, it's not going to go away. It takes time, right? It can go away, but it takes time and it takes a lot of work at it. So you do see the benefits, but what I'm saying is you can't just do 1 fast or 2 fasts and 3 fasts and say, oh, look, there's nothing, right? I went back to eating white bread and look, my sugar is high, right? That did nothing. That's not the point, right? The point is that if you kind of continue to apply these things, then you will see benefits, right? And that's the thing. If you don't eat, your sugars will go down. Now, I take the point that it's not for everybody. I'm just saying it's an option for people, right? Does everybody have to? No, not at all. And if you find that you're losing tons of muscle, then don't do it. If you're an ultra endurance athlete and you worry about it, then don't do it, right? But it's an option for people. It's an option for people to use when they need to, when they don't need to, but you can't expect that it's going to do everything. It's like you can't undo those years and years of problems in such a short time. It takes time, and you have to follow them, and you have to make sure they follow through with it, and that's what we do for people.
How do you evaluate if somebody is losing too much protein, as they're going through, and you say, how do you decide, oh, it's time to stop this particular fast or have more protein or anything like that?
That's a difficult question because measuring it is actually very difficult, right? So you can do various DEXA scans, but from a clinical standpoint, I don't do that. For the most part, most of the patients I treat are not that worried about, lifting 500 pounds, right? Deadlifting and stuff. Most of the patients are worried about their type 2 diabetes. So I take it that if muscle strength is your major concern, then maybe you shouldn't be fasting, right? But if you're worried about having type 2 diabetes, then maybe it's worth it, right? And I don't think that there is a magic number, a magic pill. To me, I say if you're worried about losing a lot of muscle, then you should probably do some exercise, right? Because we all know that if you lift weights, you will build muscle, right? Now, you do need to eat protein for that, right? Because you can't build muscle out of nothing. You do need to eat protein for that, for sure. But if it's your diabetes, if it's your weight, then it's an option for people, right? And I think that that's really my major point with the protein. Yes, perhaps you do lose some muscle. You lose some muscle with most diets, right? Most people who lose weight, if you measure them, they will lose muscle. So you saw the Biggest Loser slide, right? So you saw the muscle mass and the fat mass. You saw most of it. Now they're exercising like crazy, right? That's how they maintained a lot of muscle, but they still lost muscle, right? This is not fasting. They lost muscle, and they're exercising friggin' 5 hours a day, right? And Jillian Michaels is screaming, in their ear. You still lost muscle, right? So I'm not saying that you're not going to lose muscle ever, right? You may lose muscle, but you will with other diets too.
My real concern actually is about, and I didn't clarify this, about the brain protein, because we can actually tell people to do some mild exercise, and we know, I think, from other studies that it helps to preserve muscle mass during any kind of weight loss. So I imagine it's the same in fasting, but protein's going to come from somewhere, and so if you are preserving it in your muscle, and if your brain is 50% protein, which I like to think mine is, then we have no way of measuring what's going on in there, and that's where I'm just would be nice to have some kind of a way to evaluate that.
And this is the thing, right? If I just made up fasting yesterday, yeah, I'd say, yeah, you should be concerned, right? But we've only been doing it since the dawn of time, right? And much of it was inadvertent, right? But again, if you think that you're going to lose a lot of muscle, let's forget about a little bit of muscle here and there, right? Let's say you're going to lose a lot of muscle when you fast and gain it all back as fat. Well, what would happen, right? You'd see all those traditional societies, those, aboriginals and stuff, and they'd be nothing but fat, right? Because they had a lot of feast-famine cycles, right? So again, leaving aside some of the nitpicky stuff about whether you actually lose muscle or not, let's just say that a huge amount of skeletal muscle loss is not really within my realm of concern, only because it's withstood the test of time, right? I mean, are you saying that now that we eat all this food, we're so much more muscular than we were in 1950? I doubt it very much, right? I wouldn't be too worried about it. Again, it depends on where your concerns lie, right? If your concerns is about type 2 diabetes, then this is an effective treatment, okay? And same as the diet. If you're worried about muscle loss, then yeah, and that's your primary concern, I take that, then don't do it, right? It's not that you have to do it. But again, be clear on what your goal is, like what you're trying to get out of this diet, and be clear on what it is that you're willing to do for it, right? So if you're worried about muscle loss, yeah, exercise more. Maybe fasting is not for you.
I'd add that, so one part of the literature we didn't really talk about is the work of Bruce Bistrian around protein-sparing modified fasts. And so we talked about intermittent fasting and fat fasting, but so in the 70s and early 80s, Bistrian and colleagues did a series of trials where they were admitting participants to the hospital ward and monitoring them and monitoring their meals. But the diet that they were prescribing basically was a fast, but with enough supplementation of protein that they were retaining lean body mass.
But I view fasting as a dual-edged sword. There's a very sharp front edge of the sword that you can use for mobilizing fat, losing weight, increasing ketone levels, and the benefits of autophagy and all the other things that we're learning about the effects of fasting. But I have seen in a number of instances in my career the sharp backside of the sword, and that's what I came to talk about today. So it isn't that the others don't exist. I want to keep this in perspective and establish maybe a little bit more balance than we've seen in some of the presentations on fasting previously. There are many definitions of fasting, and I want to focus mostly on the highlighted area here. I understand there's a lot of information on benefits of partial day fasting, but there aren't that many studies that show dramatic effects. And particularly, I want to focus on longer term effects, not just short-term effects. Single day fasting, again, I'm agnostic on this. The research is, I think the really good research is in the process of being done in terms of large, well-controlled cohorts. Skipping over to 5.2, the question that I have is, are those 2 days together, simultaneous, and is it true fasting or is it just reduced energy intake on those, quote, fasting days where people eat much less food on those to be substantially hypocaloric? But the area I want to focus most on is multiple day fasting, and my definition is more than 48 hours of going without eating any calories of any form. So this is a composite diagram that was published in 1991, and this is a composite of multiple individual subjects being studied over periods out past 30 days. And this shows the basal metabolic rate as percent of the predicted value based on the Harris-Benedict equation, which was published in 1919. So this is antiquated data, but as I said, it stood the test of time. And what you can see here is that when you look at the change in basal metabolic rate, that as you get out past 5 to 10 days, there is a substantial reduction in basal metabolic rate and total energy expenditure analogous to that. And the value when you get out in the range of 30 days, you're down to about a 25% reduction in resting metabolism, which is a very substantial reduction in resting metabolism. In the yellow highlighted area up here at the top, in the first day or two, there's actually, in some studies, particularly done in lean people, there is a bump up in resting metabolism. And that's due to the catecholamine response that's needed to stimulate gluconeogenesis. And so you actually have a brief uptick. And so I've heard people say, well, fasting increases your resting metabolism. And I say, yeah, for 2 days. And then what? And I think that's an important observation. So that was a summary of very old data. This is a study published by a German group in 1981. And what they compared here was total fasting to protein supplemented fasting, a very low calorie ketogenic diet. And these are differentiated substantially in terms of the effect on resting metabolism. And as you can see in the highlighted sentence here, basal metabolic rate showed a significant decrease, 25% during total fasting. And this was for a period of 30 days. So there is this body of data that has not been refuted by, let's say, countervailing science. So I don't believe I'm cherry picking the data when I present this to you. So we try to put it into just a simple composite diagram. And if you look at it here, In the early initial few days, you can sometimes see an increase in resting metabolism, but then a long progressive thing that goes out past 30 days, where the body is becoming increasingly conservative with its calories as its energy reserves are being depleted. And this is not protected very much by adipose tissue. It's protected a little bit by adipose tissue, but having extra body fat doesn't protect your body from this decline in resting metabolism. And then the other question that has not been answered in a well-done prospective study is, okay, if it goes down that much in 30 days, and then you stop fasting, how soon does it come back up? I mean, that would be good to know. And I don't know of any paper that studied that in a prospective way. In a kind of perverse way, we do have some data on that. And that was from this really unfortunate experiment called the Biggest Loser study, where obese people who were induced to do absurd amounts of exercise and extreme caloric restriction in order to get the most rapid weight loss possible. And to the credit of some people, they decided they'd study them, not just while they were doing it, but follow them up on them. And there's this reference by Fogergill here, published in Journal of Obesity last year, in which they looked at the effects of this on resting, this experience on a group of these people on resting metabolism 5 years later. And when they did careful body composition analysis, so they measured lean body mass, and lean body mass has the highest correlation with resting metabolism across individuals. But when you took the same individual and took a kilogram of lean body mass before they went through this extreme privation and excessive exercise, they started out at 34 mils of oxygen per kilogram body weight per day at baseline. And 5 years later, even though they regained much of the weight, their resting metabolism was 27. So that's a 20% persistent reduction in resting metabolism after 5 years. So if you think this is a transient effect in everybody, maybe it is transient effect in some people, but in these people, this was not transient. This was permanent metabolic damage. And I'll just put it in those terms. This is a grumpy old internist talking. So now let's talk about nitrogen metabolism, because lean body mass is an important determinant of well-being and function. And losing lean body mass is seldom a good thing. Losing fat mass, probably a good thing. If you're a bodybuilder who decides to run a marathon, yeah, you should lose some lean body mass if you want to run a marathon. But why would you want to go out and run 27 miles anyway when you can do it in a car in a short period of time? So let's talk about, first there's a little lesson here in protein turnover. And I took a graduate course in protein metabolism. It was a whole semester at MIT, so I'm going to try to make it a little simpler for you. But if you just think in terms of what determines how much lean tissue you have in your body, part of it is how much protein is coming in your mouth. So protein intake is an important component. Let's just say someone's eating 100 grams of protein. And if they metabolize that protein and then excrete the equivalent amount as, quote, nitrogen, that 100 grams of protein is turned into about 16 grams of elemental nitrogen, which comes out of the body in multiple forms when we're in a fed state, mostly as urea. And so if you have 100 grams of protein coming in, 100 grams of protein going out, day by day you maintain the same lean body mass, which is probably a desirable thing in most states, unless you're a bodybuilder trying to be better than Arnold Schwarzenegger or something. But the interesting thing is what's going on in the middle, this what we call protein turnover. That when protein is digested, it's broken down to amino acids. They enter the bloodstream, and those entering amino acids can be used for protein synthesis. But at the same time that you're eating 100 grams of protein, your body is typically breaking down 400 grams of protein. And using the 100 grams that comes in, it's synthesizing 400 grams of protein. And then you have the equivalent of nitrogen equivalent of 100 grams coming out. In the meantime, you've got 10 kilograms of protein in your body. You know, this is the, quote, average typical 70-pound, 5'10" male kind of thing. So if you look at it, there's 1% of your body protein content is coming in each day, 1% is going out. So you think that's a pretty small amount. But if you stop the protein coming in, you don't stop the turnover. And so the excretion tends to continue. And so that leads to what we call negative nitrogen balance. And I want to talk about that. The classic studies in this were done by George Cahill's group at the Joslin Research Foundation in the 1960s and published between 1960s through about 1975. And then Cahill went on and kind of summarized this in multiple review articles. And so this is a figure taken from one of those review articles. And this shows the 15 or 16 grams of, this is urinary excretion. And there's another gram that comes from skin and hair and things like that coming off the body. So this is the 16 grams of breakdown product coming out in a normal state. And then he says, and when starvation, it comes down dramatically. So you can see there's just a little bit of urea, some ammonia, and other things like creatinine coming out in the urine. And you add those up there, about 5 grams per day. But this data has been misquoted at times where people say, look, the urea content is less than a gram. So actually when people are fasting, they're not losing lean tissue. But I'll point out that this is not the first day of fasting. This is after 28 days of fasting, after the body's had a prolonged period of time to adapt to protein deprivation. And it does that very effectively. It cuts this protein breakdown from that turnover by a factor of 4, but it takes 28 to 30 days to achieve that. In the first few days, what happens? So this is a graph that was put together by Jill Forbes and Drenick. And this was from multiple studies that they had done, and it shows nitrogen and weight losses in lean people, and those are the dashed lines here on total fasting. So lean people lose nitrogen and weight actually faster than obese people, which are these two lines, weight and nitrogen. But being severely obese doesn't protect the overweight person from this early rapid loss of nitrogen. The adiposity reduces the rate somewhat compared to a guy like me going on a fast, but not by very much. And there is a slow attenuation of the rate of loss, as you can see here. And is that an isolated observation? Has that been refuted by others? Well, there are multiple classic studies. Here's one on 72 lean and obese women fasted for 7 to 28 days. This is published by a German group back in 1975. And again, what they point out is that fasting men lose faster than women. Women are a little bit more conservative in terms of how they manage nitrogen, but both lose between 1/2 pound and 1/3 of a pound of lean body mass in the first week. So the most rapid losses are after the first few days. So when I say, well, I'm not too worried about the first few days, but after that, that's when you start to feel the backside of this sharp sword. When you're fasting, there are two things that are going on. One of them is there's something called the natriuresis of fasting. And natrium is the Latin term for sodium, and it's accelerated sodium excretion with fasting. And this is a very robust observation, and it's been very well characterized in humans and in dogs. Dogs make superb analogs for humans in that regard. And this, when you're going to nutritional ketosis, the body doesn't conserve sodium; it accelerates sodium excretion. But if you're totally fasting and you're not consuming sodium, you're going to be depleting sodium, which is mostly in the circulation and extracellular fluid. When that contracts, renin is released from the adrenals, aldosterone goes up. Aldosterone is a damaging stress hormone, and that subsequently leads to cortisol increases. And the other thing that aldosterone does is in order to try to cling to sodium, it makes the body waste potassium. So you get this double whammy of shrinking sodium volume and losses of potassium. So even if it's a few days, on those few days when you're fasting, those are days when you're not getting in sodium and potassium, and you're basically building a deficit that need to be repleted after the fast, whether it's a 2-day fast or a 1-week fast. And then also magnesium is lost as you lose lean tissue, and if you're going to gain back that lean tissue, it's going to require greater magnesium intake beyond the normal required level to achieve that. So whether it's intermittent fasting, where you have a few days of deficit per week, those days of deficit have to be made up with your diet in the intervening days, which means that the nutrient density of minerals in the diet needs to be not just adequate, but superior. And we very seldom take that into account. Interestingly, there was just this paper published, I think, last week, looking at intermittent fasting and effect on risk of hypoglycemia in a randomized controlled trial. And these were people who were fasting either for 2 days intermittently or 2 days consecutively during the week. And you can go and look at the reference, but what they found was even though they withdrew or reduced medication on the fasting days, so they told people if you're going to fast, reduce your medications, they still doubled their risk of symptomatic hypoglycemia. So when you're on a medication to control blood glucose and you markedly cut or dramatically change your carbohydrate intake from day to day, you're going to get into a roller coaster ride. And that's a risk. And finally, I'm thrilled Dr. Bickman mentioned refeeding syndrome. That this is something that I was not taught in medical school, but I learned it in clinical practice because much of my practice when I was in academic medicine, teaching and practicing nutrition was I was doing in-hospital nutrition support with intravenous feeding, TPN. And when you take a patient who's been fasting, they get transferred from a hospital where they didn't do TPN, this was back in the old days, and they came to our center where we did do TPN, and the surgeons would tell the pharmacist, start them on TPN, and the nurse and the pharmacist would put them on TPN with high glucose and the normal amount of phosphorus, magnesium, and potassium. We would oftentimes see profound reductions in the blood levels of potassium, magnesium, and phosphorus, which can impair respiratory and cardiac function. They say, hey, the guy looked pretty good. We put him on TPN, and now he's on the ventilator and comatose. What happened? And this guy's phosphorus level's 1.0, and it should be above 2.8. And that's refeeding syndrome. How was this discovered? This was discovered when people were rescued from lifeboats or rescued from situations of prolonged starvation, and to be nice to them, they gave them copious amounts of food. When you're fasted and then you suddenly feed, particularly with carbohydrates, and you put a lot of glycogen into a glycogen-depleted muscle, potassium, magnesium, and phosphorus have to shift out of the plasma into the muscle, and you create at least oftentimes profound transient blood levels, lowered blood levels of those key minerals, and you can put a person into coma, heart failure, and even kill them by doing this. And it's something that should not be ignored. And after a prolonged fast, someone really needs careful dietary and medical supervision through the feeding period. And just telling the person, as is quoted in one popular book, just don't binge, I don't think is adequate respect for this dangerous situation. So the summary is, early and ongoing lean tissue losses are not minor, that there can be prolonged reductions in resting metabolic rate, and the longer one fasts, the greater the reduction goes down, and we don't know how fast or what the individual variations for people in recovery of this important metabolic parameter. That one of the behavioral problems with intermittent fasting is that if you do it 1 day a week and you get some benefit, and then that tapers off and you want to get more benefit, then you do it 2 days, and then you say, well, I'll try a 7-day fast, and you end up with a law of diminishing returns. And people want to keep this line going down straight by doing more and more extreme efforts. And that's the slippery slope, and we should stay away from that. And I already belabored the issue of refeeding syndrome, and I'll quit there. Thank you much.
Yes. Hi, my name is Nadia Pataguana. I'm one of the IDM fasting coaches. So I first wanted to thank Dr. Phinney for pointing out that we also believe that 30 days of fasting or extended fasting can be quite dangerous. Most often is, with or without medical supervision, but obviously without medical supervision. My only question, and I'm asking this on behalf of some of my patients that are listening live, is if Dr. Phinney believes that fasting, water fasting, will have the same effect on the body that low-calorie diets or starvation diets or the Biggest Loser diets will have on the body.
There's limited data. I have to keep saying that, sorry. But we have done studies with very low-calorie ketogenic diets, and I think one needs to differentiate between ketogenic and not, because we now know ketones are a potent epigenetic signal for a number of very important processes in the body.
Yes.
That we can preserve lean body mass and better preserve resting metabolism when protein is provided in the context of as a supplemented fast as opposed to a total fast. But realize also people vary one from another, and there is no perfect diet that's whether it's a guideline or my plate or what I say works for me, that works for everybody else. And so I think people need to be open to the possibility that there may be some harmful effects with too much fasting, but we will vary one from another in how we handle that. So I think Bob Dylan said it best, and I'm not being facetious here, and I said, don't follow leaders and watch for parking meters. And including don't follow me. You know, people say, what do you do? I want to do what you do. And I say, you're not my clone, you're not my identical twin.
Sorry,
So,
the reason why I'm asking this specifically is because I agree with you about the extended fasting and the dangers of it, right? But a lot of people here do some intermittent fasting or some 2 or 3 day fasts. The reason why I'm asking this is because a lot of the examples I used today to show some of the damaging effects of extended fasting were based on low-calorie diets and not on fasting, correct?
most of the data I showed was on total fasting. Complete fasting, no calories taken in. And again, I tried to make it clear that I have no problem with up to 2 days of fasting, as long as there's good nutrient density in the diet following that. It's when people get beyond 2 days, and certainly when they get beyond a week or more of total caloric fasting that I see major concerns on the other side, sharp side of the sword showing up.
Okay, well, then about the Biggest Loser contest not being the same as extended fasting, right?
Understood.
Okay.
But that was a extreme of relative caloric restriction. The weight loss was extremely rapid, and it involved what I think are excessive amounts of exercise. And don't get me into this, but actually high volume exercise and combined with caloric restriction has been shown in 4 inpatient studies to reduce resting metabolism.
Got it.
So again, yeah,
Thank you.
more science to be done.
In your talk, it seemed like you were giving the connotation that a lowered metabolic rate was a bad thing. Can you comment on that? Do we know that having a lower metabolic rate is truly a bad thing?
Awesome question, Dr. Westman. If I were Ray Wolford and part of the caloric restriction longevity movement, I would say lower resting metabolic rate is associated with greater longevity. But if you're trying to manage your weight, it's a two-edged sword. So, nothing is pure in medicine. Nothing's 100% in medicine. And that's why my talk was not, a one-sided blade. It's a two-sided blade. And we need to keep those perspectives in balance. But if people are feeling cold all the time and they don't have energy to get up and out of their chair and do stuff, and I've dealt with people who've been on prolonged supplemented fasting, and I did it too. I encouraged them to do it. And these are the people who had to wear a sweater to a theater in July because the air conditioning made it too cold for them to sit in the theater and watch a movie. And they felt, fatigued and cold all the time. And in part, it's not hypothyroidism. We tested for that. It's probably to a great extent reduced lean body mass. And again, people have differential responses. Just be aware that some people will have responses that feel more negative than they want them to be.
But I have a question for Dr. Phinney, and it's regarding fasting and the differentiation between a lean person fasting and an obese person fasting. So a lean person with, say, 10 pounds of body fat who can produce 300 calories of energy for their daily use, and somebody with, say, 100 pounds who can produce 3,000 calories of energy for use. My question really is that a nuance that's worth mentioning when it comes to fasting? Because the person who is producing adequate energy shouldn't need to recruit amino acids to supplement their caloric use. And plus, they're also able to produce more substrate for gluconeogenesis that doesn't require protein. So would that be a useful nuance in talking about fasting?
As I showed in one of my slides from the study by Forbes and Drenick published in 1979, I memorized that. They showed that when they fasted lean people, the rate of weight loss was greater and the rate of lean tissue loss was greater. So the obese patients had some degree of protection, but it was like 20% less lean body mass lost per week of fasting, if you will.
And did they say how obese they were? Were these obese 1, 2, or 3?
These were very severely obese patients.
Okay.
And these are people they kept on fast for up to 60 days. Back in the days when we were allowed to do that. And the side effects of that are such that IRB's human subject approval is withheld from people wanting to do that kind of extreme fasting these days.
Is there any evidence of the metabolic rate drop for people who have adequate energy from storage? So, for example, the people in the Fothergill study, I call it the Kevin Hall Biggest Loser study, because Kevin Hall himself can't explain the metabolic slowdown. If you ask him, he'll say, "Oh, my model doesn't really explain that very well."
And again, in the first set of slides, I showed the reduction in resting metabolism in both lean and obese people.
Okay.
So adiposity doesn't protect one from.
So access to energy doesn't protect you from.
Correct.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. And it's an unfortunate reality of the data as currently is published.
Okay.
Thank you for your questions.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I really want you guys to keep in mind during the rest of my talk is our patient demographic. So we are not fasting high-performance athletes on a day-to-day basis. We have 12 in about 5,000 patients. So when Jason and I share our fasting protocols, share our protein recommendations, we're talking about the majority of our patient population. We're not talking about the 12 patients that are actively training twice a day for 90 minutes, 7 days of the week, where their livelihood depends on their athletic performance. So when we treat these individuals, now that we've started, we would never do any insane fasting regimen with these patients. We usually cap them to about 16 hours, and occasionally we go really wild and limit them to 24 hours. But we never would ever fast them for something like 28 or 38 days. They do not have the body fat to support that duration of fast on a regular basis. So that's one thing I want you to keep in mind throughout this talk is our patient demographic. It is very different than many of our other colleagues who have presented at this conference today. We have very sick, very sedentary people. So this is a randomized controlled trial. They did alternate daily fasting of 0 calories and daily caloric restriction, where they reduced the patients from about 2,500 calories a day to 2,000 calories a day and assessed them over 32 weeks. They both lost about the same weight, but what was interesting was the kind of weight that they lost. So their total fast percentage in the low calorie group, or the calorie restriction group, was only down 0.7%. Whereas in the alternate daily fasting group, their total body fat percentage was down 2.4%. With their trunk fat mass percentage, so trunk fat, that's all your visceral fat, that's all that disease-causing fat. In the calorie restriction group, we only saw it down 0.3%, but in alternate daily fasting, we saw it down 1.8%. And now on to lean mass. In the calorie restricted group, we saw their lean mass go up about by 0.5%. And when your body fat goes down, your lean mass is going to go up. But it only went up about 0.5% in this calorie restricted group. But in the alternate daily fasting group, it went up by 2.2%. So even though during periods of fasting, you will have some protein breakdown for gluconeogenesis, but you have substantial growth hormone. So you replace old muscle with new muscle. So I'm briefly going to touch base on some concerns that were brought up during yesterday's talk about fasting. And these are common concerns that Jason and I hear about all of the time. So first I'm going to talk about electrolytes. In 5 years, we have yet to have an issue with electrolyte depletion or electrolyte insufficiency. So electrolytes, the important ones that we take into consideration are sodium, chloride, potassium, calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium. So sodium and chloride are salts. We do recommend patients take salt during a fast, and that varies. It's very custom. It depends on the person's activity level and their health history. So we adjust the amount of salt that our patients take based on their health needs. And we do recommend that patients take some good quality Himalayan salt or Celtic salt throughout their fast. Salt's very important because as you start fasting and cutting out the carbs, your insulin levels go down. And that causes your kidneys to release all kinds of water and all kinds of salt. So we definitely don't want to have any issues with refeeding syndrome. So we really recommend salt, but that has to be very individual. All the other ones, potassium. We check patients' blood all of the time. When someone does a 7-day fast, we might check it 2 or 3 times during that 7-day fast. We do find that potassium levels change, but they might go from 4.5 millimoles per liter to 4.3 millimoles per liter. The change is very minor, and not once has anyone ever dropped below the normal range. Not once in 5 years. Doesn't mean we might never see it, but we're really optimistic that it's not going to be a future issue. Magnesium, we recommend it to everyone. Citrate or glycinate, we start out, like Evelyn said, at about 400 milligrams a day, and we work up from there. Calcium and phosphorus, they remain stable during a fast. So this guy here we're about to talk about, I have a couple slides on him, is Angus Barbieri. He's that lunatic that fasted for 382 days. But he was not one malnourished guy. He started out at 456 pounds, but he fasted very smart. He was given nutrients via IV very frequently during this fast. So the top graph here, you'll see his magnesium levels definitely dropped within the first 50 days of his fast. But they stabilized at the lower end of the normal range, but never did they really drop below the normal range. Same thing with calcium, potassium levels, minor shifts, but all within the normal range. So if a patient meets the criteria where they might be susceptible to developing refeeding syndrome after a fast, we just focus with time-restricted eating. That means they eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and they just don't snack. So it's not like they're going for significant periods of fasting, maybe at most 13 or 14 hours from the time they finish dinner to the time they woke up in the morning. It's very important you don't fast people for extended periods of time when they're a high-risk patient. For patients who are more accepted or more comfortable fasting, we might just start them off doing sort of a 16-8 or an 18-6 fast. That means that they skip one meal a day. So they'll either have breakfast and lunch and skip dinner, or they'll have lunch and dinner and they'll skip breakfast that day. Typically, we use intermittent fasting protocols with our patients, so 24, 36, or 42 hours of intermittent fasting. And we found the frequency that we need to get decent, consistent results with our patients is about 3 times a week. It appears that 1 to twice a week just has more of a maintenance response where they're able to balance out the patient's diet, where they might have eaten out and had more carbs than they wanted or had hidden carbs in their diet, or they ate a little bit more and ate past satiation a few times that week. But 1 to twice a week is good for maintenance. But to really see consistent progress on a week-to-week basis, we will ask our patients to fast about 3 times per week. So that's the magic frequency of these intermittent fasts that we found worked best at our clinic over the last 5 years. Now, with the right patient and with medical supervision, we will recommend prolonged periods of fasting. The longest we allow a patient to fast for is 14 days. These patients are not at risk for refeeding syndrome, or we would not fast them for that long in the first place. They are very well hydrated and encouraged to take electrolytes, and I'll talk to you about what is permitted during a fast in some follow-up slides. So we watch them very carefully. We check their blood work very frequently during this fast too, to see what happens to their electrolytes, to make sure that they're not becoming depleted of very important electrolytes like sodium, potassium, magnesium, phosphorus, things that might lead to refeeding syndrome. So we're very cautious. We also don't recommend prolonged fasts all of the time. We found that consistency is key with our patients. So intermittent fasting is just a lot more flexible. Every week of the year, I cannot fast for 5 days. I've got my mother's birthday, my husband and I want to go out on a date night, I have a business lunch. It's impossible to keep up these prolonged periods of fasting all of the time. So intermittent fasting is generally what our patients do. But periodically, for the right patient, we will fast them anywhere from 2 to 14 days. So maybe once, sort of every 4 to 8 weeks, but not something that we usually recommend on a consistent basis. So how do we determine what is the right and what is the safe fasting protocol for patients? So there's different considerations we have to take into account when directing our patients towards what fasting regimen might be best for them. So medical considerations. So again, 1 to twice a week of intermittent fasting is usually what we do for sort of disease prevention or for maintenance mode. So for someone who comes to our clinic, for those really healthy people that come to us and say, we just want to stay healthy, we would recommend that they do a 24-hour fast 1 or twice a week. For patients who are looking to actively treat some sort of condition, we have them fast 3 times a week. So various intermittent fasting protocols we recommend. The first one is a 24-hour fast. So you'd essentially fast from like dinner tonight until dinner tomorrow, or lunch today until lunch tomorrow, a 24-hour period of time. We usually recommend this fasting regimen from people who don't have that much body fat to lose. So they're looking to lose their last 25, 30 pounds, nothing substantial. We also recommend this to people who are borderline diabetic, people who are diabetic and aren't on any diabetic medications yet, and also to those who are very ill. You never want to fast someone for a significant period of time when they're combating all kinds of health issues. So a person on dialysis places a lot of stress on the body, and also dialysis patients are restricted to their fluid intake. We don't want to risk them becoming dehydrated. So we would work them up to doing a 24-hour fast from time-restricted eating, but we would cap them at 24 hours. So for those who are really ill, or those who are in the midst of combating some sort of other major condition, we block them at fasting for 24 hours. So again, you've got to take all these things in consideration. You can't fast someone who's got less than 10% body fat for 30 days. You can't fast someone with congestive heart failure on fluid restriction for 30 days. So it's about being very smart and very cautious and working your way up, assessing your patients very frequently to see how their individual body is responding.
So I wanted to have this conversation among the scientists in our community, and found that to be a point that maybe some people don't want to talk about. So when it comes to short-term fasting, skipping 2 meals out of 3 per day, 16, whatever, it's a 16-hour fast or whatever, I have no concerns with that based on what I know about protein metabolism and the lean tissue preservation. I have kind of been conditioned by my experience working previously in in-hospital settings with protein malnourished patients, people with kwashiorkor, that giving up lean body mass is something that I've kind of come to, I'm reluctant to accept. I am concerned that there is a very significant literature going back 100 years on human fasting. There's a classic experiment done in 1919 by Benedict, and you can search that. And this is not understanding the metabolism of fasting is not new. In fact, most of the research was done classically through the late 1960s into maybe 1970. And since then, there hasn't been much published because all the stuff I published repeats of stuff that was done, validly many, many decades ago. But I'm concerned when you get to durations of fasting beyond 48 hours, because there are many studies done by very competent researchers published in, and the fact that it was done 50 years ago doesn't make it wrong, that indicates that 48 hours into a total fast where you're eating no protein, even if you're adapted, keto adapted, the body to power gluconeogenesis is going to break down some protein. And the amount that is broken down starting on day 2 accelerates to day 4 of a fast, where the rate of protein breakdown is equivalent to 3/4 of a pound of lean body mass loss per 24 hours. If you go beyond a week, the rate of protein breakdown begins to slow down. So you got this quick uprise and then a slow decline. And when you got to 3 weeks and then 4 weeks, it plateaus out at 1/4 pound of lean tissue loss per day. Can most healthy humans tolerate that amount of loss? For a month, yes. Most healthy humans can survive that. But there is something on the order of 10% of the body's lean tissue is lost after 28 days of a total fast. And I don't consider that benign, because the rate at which we lose it is typically much faster than the rate we can gain it back when we go back to eating enough calories and protein. I have at least, not theoretical, but physiological reasons for concern about preservation of lean body mass. Now, is there one experiment that demonstrates that? No, I've got 5. I can show you the slides. but I won't bore you with old, decrepit-looking, hand-drawn things published in the ancient literature. But it's a consistent result. So when someone claims that there's negligible lean tissue loss by humans, even 2 or 3, 4 days into fasting, I'd say, where's the data? Show me the published data. And don't tell me that person's professional opinion is equally as good as my professional opinion when they don't have data to back it up. The other concern I have is that resting metabolism is a highly variable aspect in each human, and that we inherit variations in resting metabolism per kilogram of lean body mass. But we know that resting metabolism is tied to lean body mass. So the more lean body mass you have, on average, the higher your resting metabolic rate, the less lean body mass you have, the lower it is. So losing lean body mass will lower your resting metabolism. But in addition to that, human metabolism can respond to caloric deprivation much more rapidly than we lose lean tissue. That your body, when it perceives a threat to its energy balance, a sudden loss, a sudden famine, loss, all food disappears. You can turn your metabolism down 25% within a week or 2 of complete starvation, complete fasting. And I'm aware of claims that your fasting metabolism actually goes up when you fast. Your resting metabolism goes up when you fast. And the only evidence for that I'm aware of is when you acutely deprive people of sodium as well as calories. Salt concentration or salt availability in the body goes down, so the circulation shrinks. In order to keep blood flow, you have to pulse out a lot of adrenaline and noradrenaline. When you do that, that will transiently cause your resting metabolism to go up until you collapse. And when people talk about adrenal fatigue, by the way, there is no medical diagnosis in medical textbooks of adrenal fatigue. That's collapse of the circulatory system because the adrenaline and cortisol responses of the adrenals are not adequate to maintain circulation in the face of too little salt. So the decline in resting metabolism has been, with fasting, is not just purely tied to the loss of lean body mass, it's tied to the body's basically sense of an emergency and turning down metabolism promptly. And again, the rate at which that comes back up to your previous baseline after a period of acute famine has not been carefully studied. So these are academic concerns on my part, but until someone proves that when this is rationally used in a person's care that significantly enhances their outcome in terms of well-being and function over months or years, compared to using a well-formulated ketogenic diet without adding fasting, prolonged periods of fasting, I beg to remain a skeptic.